Huh, okay. Well, there is a migrant crisis with, I guess, Middle Eastern Arab refugees in North Africa. And there's this big event that happened in Cologne, Germany, and a few other cities where allegedly a bunch of um, migrants or people of North African descent um, sexually molested a bunch of women. According to this NPR article, there have been 379 victim complaints just in one night in the city of Cologne, and apparently no arrests, which is pretty shocking. I would assume the rule of law in Germany would apply, but I guess it depends on um, who needs to be, who has the rules applied to them. I think the news the mainstream media spin on the whole issue is kind of obfuscating a lot of the truth in favor of an agenda, which is just mainly helping out the migrants moving to certain countries in Europe. But what Europe may not fully anticipate is that they can't necessarily run background checks on every single person who becomes a refugee or a migrant, what have you, because not everyone has documentation or paperwork to describe who they are, which is kind of a volatile proposition to put forth. So you have a country and you're inviting in essentially foreigners who don't necessarily understand the language, who don't necessarily understand the rules of the society, and more or less haven't really been there since longer than 6 months and are expected to, I guess, assimilate. Well, uh, there's some growing pains in that logic because you have people coming in who aren't necessarily legal citizens because of an open border policy, to my understanding. Um, and the good nature of the accepting countries like Germany and Sweden are just getting taken advantage of by human nature, and especially cultures and societies that aren't necessarily used to the way things are done in the West. Um, if you come from a more theocratic background that believes in a particular religion, say Islam, you may have counterproductive uh, beliefs about the role of women in society. So, in a lot of Middle Eastern countries, as you know, women are under either Shahara law or very strict supervision by Muslim men, Islamic men too. And the main gist of that is they treat the women more like subhuman than uh, equal partners, which is not how the West works at all, because the West treats everybody ideally equally. Um, so then you have this conflict, like what was happening on New Year's Eve. You have a bunch of alleged migrants or refugees who carried out a bunch of crimes, probably knowing their crimes because they would be essentially punished in their homeland. But I would say, did it in defiance of the police and the rule of law of Germany. Because one, um, the Merkel Germany wants to have a bunch of um, wants to be. I guess they're compensating for past crimes, I guess, and want to be a shining example of multiculturalism and doing the morally right thing. However, if you do the morally right thing, you may have conflict with amoral people or people who don't necessarily have your best interest. If we make the assumption that everybody who's a refugee is a morally good person, then it's probably a bad assumption to make just based on how human nature is. Individuals are typically interested, and especially without background checks or necessarily paperwork to enter a country, there's no basis to judge someone's moral character besides what they can say. And people can say whatever they want about themselves, and especially if their identities are pretty much a blank slate, which I'd imagine a refugee or migrant could potentially pull off. Now, this isn't to say most migrants aren't good people, but begs the question, how do you check someone's legitimacy as a decent human being when they don't have paperwork, they don't have witnesses to judge someone's character, they're just going off of goodwill. Anyways, this ties into Germany and the attacks on, I guess now, 370 victims in Cologne on New Year's Eve, because a lot of the alleged perpetrators are of North African or Arab descent. And if you have no basis for judging someone's character, you just basically have a bunch of random people who aren't being tracked or spied upon necessarily, having a field day and celebrations. Because if you heard some of the allegations, they were pretty bad. It was more like bringing the, I guess you could say, bringing the rape culture from the Middle East to Europe. Because I haven't necessarily heard of widespread like physical rape culture outside of a Middle Eastern or Indian context. Maybe African too, but generally speaking, in Western societies, a physical rape culture doesn't exist to the extent that it does in India and the Middle East, where a gang of men can just approach a woman and essentially take advantage of her and rape her, and there'd be no punishment. The be a lack of evidence, all this other stuff. So it's kind of weird to see how a clash of refugee migrant agenda and the feminist agenda coalesce in this whole thing. Because normally, if you believe in the privileged classes of minorities and all that stuff, you would know that on the one hand you have Arabic, Muslim, Islamic refugees who don't necessarily have a home anymore because of the whole Middle Eastern wars, and have all this progressive backing to support their agenda. Or you'd have you have the Western feminist agenda, third wave feminism, who more or less treat themselves as second-class citizens, though in reality they have more privilege than most of these migrants who are coming from this different culture of theirs, different countries. So, like in this image right here, you have essentially a German woman, I'm assuming, who's protesting against, I guess, the gang rape in Cologne. I guess suspects have been taken, half of whom were asylum seekers, so there's pretty strong evidence that foreigners are causing the crime. And I think I read somewhere that Merkel acknowledged that foreign individuals have more tendency to violence or criminal activities, which is kind of surprising because that begs another question, like why would you import crime and why would you import rape culture? And then you have graphic details like women have been touched and sometimes their clothes been torn apart. They have been insulted, they have been surrounded by groups of men attacking them. A gruesome situation, I just feel powerless and hope that okay. But there hasn't really been necessarily a response, but besides we'll be tougher on the criminal activities of migrant men, I'm assuming. But then you have these opinion articles that basically go over the far right of Germany, which I guess for the most part are kind of they're going to be reacting to what's going on with the migrant crisis, because Europe has this long history of anti-gypsy sentiment, because gypsies are seen in a lot of countries as the scum of the earth, lowest of the low. Law doesn't apply to them, therefore it's justified to discriminate against them because they're not playing by the rules. That sentiment is probably transferring over to the migrant crisis, because all the individuals, I'm assuming, don't understand the law and think that they have free range and are a protected class, which is what I brought up with the feminist thing. A protected class that can act without retribution or anything like that. This site just has a bunch of statistics based on the population of Muslim and people of Arab descent, I'm assuming. The 800,000 migrants arriving in Germany in 2015 combined with the 77,000 natural increase would indicate the Muslim population in Germany jumped by 877,000 to reach an estimated 595,945,000 individuals by the end of 2015. So just in 1 year, the population of Muslims added about 1 million individuals, more or less. Well, less than 1 million, but close to it. And which leaves Germany with one of the highest Muslim populations in Western Europe. Now, if you remember just a couple months ago, because of the whole Paris attacks, 130 just normal French and international people were killed in Paris during multiple bombing attacks, which were carried out by ISIS, surprisingly, because initially Obama earlier in the week said ISIS is contained, and then clearly they weren't contained, they were just getting started, and they jumped to more of a anti-France stance. And then Charlie Hebdo killing earlier in the year that killed the the journalists, the satirical journalists, they were also specifically targeted because of a satirical cartoon featuring the Prophet Muhammad. So there's this culture, literally a culture war, maybe an actual war in France against the whole idea of a French republic. A republic that believes in multiculturalism, um, inalienable rights, which may contradict the rule of Allah and Islamic law, and just essentially everything that would be counter to ISIS. Because you had Al Qaeda, which mainly focused on its groups in the countries where it was located, but then ISIS is using its internet presence to proliferate itself throughout the world and create like local cells and spreading its anti-American Western ideals message where no, you can't have freedom of speech. No, it must be restricted. You can't have an open marketplace of ideas. You can't do anything that you desire that goes against biblical texts, specifically that of the Quran or the word of Allah, which essentially is arbitrary anyways, because there's multiple versions and then there's different sects, so there's no like standardization or justification between any of the rules, because they're all fairly arbitrary and they can differ in intensity. Because imagine you have the Shia, and the Sunnis, like three different Arabic denominations, essentially equivalent to like Protestant and Christian. I mean, Protestant and Catholic, just minor differences, but they all believe that their word is the word of God. And then combine that with just the general feelings of ruling without a common basis, just ruling from biblical texts. I guess you could call it Sharia law. You have this clash of ideals, attack on basically Western societies, which is kind of scary, because imagine in the United States where you have your Bill of Rights and then you have a basic tenets of freedoms guaranteed to you if you're a citizen or even a foreigner visiting as a citizen. Like, United States sets in theory a great standard of freedom of speech, but there are costs to that freedom, which probably relates to this belief that true freedom isn't necessarily a attainable goal, but some freedom light will work. Anyways, yeah, this is all just statistics on how everything is flowing. And Breitbart. Oh yeah, I saw this article. I think it's an opinion piece because it's not necessarily factual, but in the defense of the 143 versus 1500, what's going on here is that you have 143 officers to patrol the Cathedral Cologne area, and they weren't expecting a mass demonstration of 1,000 men to molest women. But here, this Pegidra anti-Islamic group, which is considered far right by the Merkel government, is demonstrating, and they were given ample time. So this number is because they knew that they were doing this, whereas this number they didn't know it was happening, and for the most part, it the they did know it was happening, so it's not like they can prepare it against the 1,000 or so migrants or men, since you can't necessarily claim that you know each one was a migrant, but it's probably a good chance. Anyways, this article is just basically saying, hey, why is there such a strong response against protesters? Well, apparently these protesters have similar views tilting towards like Nazism and uh, and restrictions of specific races. So Germany has to quash that sentiment because they can't be compared to Nazis or whatever. And then in this article, it's kind of surprising how it took like a week for this to blow up and to take notice, because initially it was kind of hush hush, the initial complaints. Oh wow, even more. 516 complaints have been followed by Sunday. 40% them for sexual offenses and 2 rape allegations. So the numbers just keep going up. So it's just like a field day against the whole, just everybody in Germany or Cologne. Wow, 156. And those are individual people, so that means 1,000 men or more, probably more. All were like, "Yeah, let's go do this. This is great, and we can get away with it." Which probably the vast majority of them will, which is really disheartening. And this put pressure on Merkel to actually care about the people in Germany, the ones who are actually citizens first, rather than the interests of the migrants. The whole thing just kind of leaves a sour taste in your mouth, because one side it seems like you have the politically correct answer, which is taking the migrants and save them from their eternal destitute, or keep them out and be heartless and suffer. But I mean, a middle ground would be just to, have waiting periods and maybe set up refugee camps overseas with the intention of bringing people over who pass the vetting process. Right, so Merkel's saying repugnant criminal offenses that require a response, but what response? 49% of Germans fear to repeat it in their own hometowns. And I saw Google statistics of firearms licenses shooting up for within the last few months. Unprecedented violence. Apply for asylum in the country illegally. Huh. Yeah, it's not good when a country can't track its people, or just foreign people, because then there's no rule of organization or rule of law that can actually contain somebody if they act outside the rule of the law. Like, for example, if you live in Britain or the US or Australia, the State Department probably has at least a birth certificate or some kind of information on you. Whereas if you're a refugee, you probably don't have any of that information because you lost it all, and there's no way of verifying who you are. And this whole idea of integration, well, I don't think integration is necessarily a possible thing because it requires education on how Germany's rule of law works, and there's just going to be certain groups of refugees who will want to bring over their way of life as well as their law that they lived in, depending on if they had laws, to the new country. Who are they to learn German's rule of laws? It's not like Germany is, just because they give them a place to live doesn't mean they have to help that they have to learn the rule of law, even though that's exactly how it is. But in their mind, they probably think like, oh, I can do as I please. So, second thoughts on supporting an open door policy. Well, that will. If you have an open door policy, you can just give a simple example. Would you allow a stranger, regardless of nationality, live in your home without first vetting that person and knowing who he is? Would you keep your doors unlocked? Would you allow them into your home and just let them set up indefinitely without a plan to leave? Probably not. That's more or less a common sense kind of thing, because one, you don't know if they have the resources to support themselves. Two, you're not required to support a stranger, especially one who just invited themselves into your home. And three, it's not safe, it's not secure. You have locks on your door for a reason. An open door migrant policy again assumes that everyone's a good person, but this doesn't match with how reality actually works. Not everyone is a good person. You don't have locks on your door to keep out the good people, you have locks on your door to keep out potentially bad people. And you can't know until you talk to them and get to know them and vet them. And furthermore, if they have no background, then you probably shouldn't let them in. I think every woman is afraid to walk around here. Well, the rule of law goes out the window. Then it'd be kind of scary to trust your government, especially when they're undermining that state of law. Society must increasingly decide what side am I on. Well, water cannon to disperse the crowd. What side are you on? Are you a clear-cut humanitarian who believes people are genuinely good and deserve a fair shake at a new life? Or are you the opposite extreme and think everybody should be kept out, not given a fair shake? Well, you could also be in the middle. You don't have to allow migrants in, but you select that route, you better have an alternative. It's kind of like with saying no and not choosing an alternative when you go out with your friends to just hang out. By just saying no, you're placing the emphasis back on the person to decide what to do. And if they keep recommending the answers and you don't act, they're probably going to get their way because there's no viable alternative. However, if you work on a viable alternative, then every party involved could potentially agree upon that alternative. Like, in this case, the migrants are leaving their homes because there's no society really in existence, or the cost of living is so high compared to the potential for a new life in a European country. Um, there's no real uh, basis for staying in a country when there's no future for you or your family or your people unless there's a society and a structure to maintain that. Africa isn't spoken a lot about in the West, but it has all these similar issues with people who are just trying to live a normal life. You need a civil infrastructure that can carry out basic needs such as transportation, irrigation slash farming, uh, a civil network of and security, police enforcement. The reason foreigners enter a new country, such as, say, Europe or a European country or the United States, is because we have established a rule of law and you have the potential to make a lot of money and be self-sustaining, have a viable future for your family. Our customs, our way of life have facilitated this ability to allow people to do as they please so long as they don't harm others and believe what they want to believe, again, as long as they don't harm others, but pretty much live a prosperous life, as opposed to these migrant countries in the Middle East where the only alternative is to leave, because if they stay, they might as well be dead and caught between the crossfire of a civil war or a brutal dictator or any means of destabilization of the nation state. So you have to restabilize the region and not leave an imbalance of power or a vacuum of power even. And the only real way to do that is have a group of people democratically elect local members to run the heads of states or local counties or cities even, and have like a democratic system that keeps people content on running the society the way they want to. Because who knows, maybe Shahara law works in that part of the country because it aligns with their philosophical beliefs. But if that causes constant civil war, then maybe they should reconsider the rule of law from a theocratic one to one that's more of a objective viewpoint, humanist viewpoint, you could say. So if you say no migrants, the alternative should be we should give aid to rebuild this country and allow different groups of people to want to go back to their homeland and live there and live a comfy way of life like they do in Western Europe or the United States, because it is comfy. And the only way to like maintain that is to abide by the societal rules. And when you have things like mass rape or immigration that's causing the privileged people in society to lose their comfort, to more or less sacrifice their well-being for the moral benefit of another, then you're gonna get a lot of anger and unrest from what used to be normal people. I mean, you can radicalize like independent, normal people who don't really care about this if they're personally affected by the by an international event such as the migrant crisis. Because say you have like normal Germans just doing business related stuff, but then you have this Cologne thing where people get raped and women don't feel safe walking the street because men who look different, act different, believe different religious beliefs or philosophical beliefs about women can just do as they please and uh, not abide by the same set of rules, that's a little terrifying. Because as a society or as a nation state, you create this structure, this framework for which citizens of the society must behave by. And I would think, at the very least, if you're a migrant to a country, you would learn the language, of course, learn the law, but also have like a training time period for where you can adapt to the new custom. Now, because the crisis is called a crisis because they didn't have much time to think this out and they acted with their heart instead of their brain. It feels good to take in a bunch of refugees and migrants, but in hindsight, you get all this back backfire that can potentially rise up from simply just not thinking things out properly. Okay, thanks for watching, and hopefully the migrant crisis gets resolved within the next few months, though it's probably going to get worse before it gets